My name is Janice Kirsch. I'm a physician, also trained in public health. Climate change is the greatest public health threat that humankind has ever faced. Now that's kind of a bleak statement, and I'll carry it even a little bleaker before I talk about the hopeful side, because there is that. We can look at the bubonic plague, and in comparison to climate change, the bubonic plague is a bad rash. That sounds a little bit harsh, but it's true. Upwards of 100 million people died in the Spanish flu in the beginning, near the beginning of the last century. Yet, climate change, climate disruption, climate chaos has the potential of taking out civilization and even leading to widespread extinction, including our own. Boy, I'm a cheery little person, aren't I? But I wouldn't be here. I would be binge watching The Real Housewives of Berkeley if I didn't think that there was a way out. There is a way out, but I need to call this an emergency because that's what it is. And then the question becomes, well, how emergent is an emergency? First of all, let me introduce the group. I've introduced myself. I'm speaking on behalf of 350 Bay Area. And 350 Bay Area is responding to that emergency on multiple levels, and which I'll tell you about all of the different levels and campaigns in a little while. What I mean by an emergency is that we don't have several decades to mitigate climate change, to adapt to climate change, to save civilization and the natural world. But we do have some time, and that's why I'm here, because I know that if we all are all hands on deck, ready to work, and then we actually can make a difference. And it's the best fight you can ever be involved in. So 350, as I said, largely, almost entirely volunteer organization. We are a grassroots organization working in the Bay Area, but also, especially through our legislative campaign, we work in Sacramento, obviously lobbying, but also the legislative campaign interweaves with other campaigns that we are involved in. We are a group that is also interested not just in drastic reductions in fossil fuel emissions. We are also interested in equity, social equity. So making sure that people get full employment and the transition from fossil fuels is a just one. We also are strongly in support of environmental justice. The people who are on the front lines need to be aided really, really emergently. And the rest will follow because we're all in this together. Now I want to talk a little bit, or a lot, about what we're dealing with. So the famous blue marble picture from outer space, I think this is from the last Apollo shot. And it's really beautiful. In this one, you can see something I'm going to be talking about not too long from now called albedo. And what I'm talking here about is the ice. And that's white. And that becomes very important. But also, it's freaking beautiful. But there's one more beautiful thing about it. And that is the fact that what you can't see. And what I'm going to steal a lot from Carl Sagan today. He called this a planet graced by life. And to me, that's the most beautiful thing. To quote somebody else who's not really Carl Sagan, and some of you won't remember, there was George Carlin, a famous comedian, said, well, you know, the planet's going to be just fine if you want to mess it up environmentally, but you better pack your bags. Okay, well, we don't want to be in that situation of having to pack our bags. This beautiful blue marble will remain for a long time. But a planet graced by life looks like this. This, our California, this kind of beauty. I was a country oncologist living out in Mendocino, which isn't quite the Bay Area, but close enough, and took this picture. as beautiful as California is, and here's a picture closer to home, you may recognize Alcatraz awaits you, and a little bit more ominous looking, because we are dealing in a situation that is on some levels ominous, not hopeless, ominous. And that's why the next slide that you will be seeing, with any luck, makes basically has a call, an alarm saying this is an emergency. And I'll explain later why I consider it to be an emergency and what I mean by emergency. So if you're in a hospital and you hear a hospital operator call out code blue, and they always have that, well, they don't anymore, but they used to have that nasal, you know, what that meant is that a pre-designated team of responders will go to a room where somebody was fighting for their life in a cardiopulmonary arrest, and they will do, in a focused fashion, in a fashion where they quickly decide who takes what role, and they quickly move in a concerted, committed way to do combat on behalf of life. That is what happens in a code blue. It's almost meditative. So I don't mean to gross you out by the next slide, because the person involved survived, so it's a happy story, and I think it's quite beautiful, but I'm a doctor, so I'm going to think that. What you see are a group of people who are resuscitating a person who underwent a cardiopulmonary arrest. And if you look at the faces of these folks, you will notice they're not thinking about what they're going to do tonight. They're not thinking about what they got to worry about. They're not thinking about themselves at all. And I know, because I've been involved over my life in many hundreds of these. It's, how can I say it? It's like being in a zone of complete commitment, almost meditative. And I guess that word zone is a good word. It's been described by a clinical psychologist named Margaret Klein Solomon as emergency mode. And yes, you can go there every day and still come home and still survive and not be depressed. So these people are not depressed looking, they're committed looking, and I can guarantee you, because I've been in the room with people like these, and I've been among people like these, that there is a moral call coming from deep within you. So this is the call that climate change is drawing us to. Let's get to the science. Now, when we talk about the sky, we think about, we think about we're outside, we look at the stars, and the sky goes on forever, right? There's stars and things, but actually the sky that's important in discussing climate change is a very, very thin shell of sky. It's not, Shakespeare, Hamlet talks about when you look up at the sky, this most excellent canopy, the air. Look you. Well, I don't want you to look too high. I want you to look only around a small area of the sky. That's the two lower layers of the atmosphere, the troposphere and the atmosphere up to beyond the stratosphere. This very thin shell, and you can see it because the sunrise is illuminating it. This tiny, or very thin, fragile layer. Carl Sagan again. He said that if you took a globe that, I think they still have them in high school and grade school classes, that have a globe of the world, and you painted it with a very thin layer of shellac, not too thick, no globs, real thin, and you scaled that up to the size of the Earth, that would be, in fact, how thin the layer of the atmosphere is. It's very fragile. Within that atmosphere lies the gases, the correct proportion of gases that has allowed humanity to exist and to flourish, especially in the last 10,000 years. But even when times got pretty cold, it's been a Goldilocks effect that we have had. And now we're changing that Goldilocks effect. And we're changing it basically by dumping a lot of crap, by dumping our garbage right into that. 110 10 million tons of man-made global warming pollution every 24 hours. That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of garbage poured out there free. Actually, we subsidize the people who pour it out. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanism of climate change. For a lot of you, this is going to be review. Bear with me. Sun, Earth, atmosphere, thin layer. What happens? Sunlight goes right in, goes right through the layers of those gases. Do not stop, go. Do not stop. It goes straight through. There's no blockage. The next step is that most of it, a lot of it, 50%, is absorbed by the Earth and warms the Earth, and that's a good thing. That's helped us get to that Goldilocks effect. And I'm going to put the discussion now about the darker surfaces absorb this more. So the blue of water, the brown of Earth. Believe it or not, the green of vegetation isn't quite as absorbent. So when that light comes in, it can warm the Earth. And to a point, that's a very good thing. The light surfaces, remember I talked about those white snowy things, the Arctic, the Antarctic glaciers. They reflect light. And that helps prevent overheating. When you lose those, when you have too thick of an atmosphere, too much garbage in the atmosphere, and you don't have enough reflectivity, that can become a problem. But let's continue. So, keep your eye on how thick our, we'll call this our greenhouse gas layer. That's what we're going to call that blue line that delineates the top of the atmosphere. So it's supposed to be there. There's supposed to be CO2. It's been there since there's been life. Whether you can't have, the Earth would be way too cold for life without some carbon dioxide there. So some energy is radiated back into space in the form of infrared rays, but they don't get a free pass all the way. Only some goes through, and it depends upon how thick that layer is. So the next slide tries to show that well. So you can see some of this outgoing infrared radiation gets trapped back into the Earth, warms it to the Goldilocks effect we've had going on for the last 10,000 years. Now, watch it thicken, subtle, and then you'll see more of the infrared, the heat is trapped, the thicker the greenhouse layer is, the layer of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, including methane, including nitrous oxide, at certain levels even water vapor, black carbon, etc. Okay. So just kind of, this slide will go through it all, and I can shut up for a minute and you can just review it, and it's magic. Okay, so that was a review. Now, where are the sources of greenhouse gases? And there are multiple. We won't talk in detail about all of them. The biggest source at the moment is the combustion of fossil fuel, is the use of fossil fuels. But there are others that we are going to touch upon, including things like thawing permafrost. We don't know. That has not been, we don't know the degree to which that is contributing now to the rapid increase in some of the metrics that we look at when we look at climate change. But it does contribute. What we eat, so animal agriculture, especially, well, industrial agriculture, especially animal agriculture. Cows require food that needs to be shipped from a long distance. In addition, you end up cutting down crops that could be useful in sequestering carbon, and you cut down rainforests to raise cows. Then cows have cow exhaust coming from both ends, actually. And we won't even talk about the fact that their manure, well, we will briefly, generates a lot of greenhouse gas too. So there are many ways, even buildings and the cement that is required to make buildings and the heating and cooling systems in buildings. So there are a lot of contributors, but we're going to focus mostly on the burning of fossil fuels because we know the most about it. So we have been talking about fossil fuel combustion and how it is changing the planet, thickening that layer, that big blanket that is keeping too much heat in. And let's talk about what paleoclimatologists have been observing through very, very well-validated methods of how much carbon dioxide, including ice cores and things you probably read about, over what has been happening over the last, well, we got a slide of 400,000 years. That's pretty convenient. Human beings have only trod this planet for 200,000 at most, at least as our species. So we're going to start off and note something. Why is our organization called 350? It's called 350 because that would be a tolerable level for human beings to live at in terms of 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that surrounds us. It would keep us in a Goldilocks effect. It's on the high end, but not on the, well, do you in end. So that's what we want to avoid. And what are humans and their predecessors in life on this earth used to? This slide is actually a good representation of that. And you'll see that over many eons, we're getting into geologic time here, that 400,000 years. On the ordinate here, you have the parts per million of CO2. And you'll notice that the highest that humanity has ever gotten to was roughly 300. And we tend to kind of live around 260, if you want to average it out. 260 to 280 parts per million seems to be good for, we start off right about here, seems to be pretty good for life on Earth. There are ice ages, that's what these dips are, and they occur for complicated reasons. Part of it has to do with the association with the if you will, angles and association of the sun to the earth, and they are not entirely predictable, but they occur at relatively predictable intervals. And the discussion of the science as exactly why they occur is beyond the scope of this discussion, but let's just say that we've lived through them. We can make it through an ice age. We've never had it so cold that during our era, and even 200,000 years before the time of humanity, it's never been so cold that it killed off everything. The last ice age ended at about 10,000 years ago, and then we began to come out of the ice age, and that's expected. That's what usually happens. And climatologists would now be predicting to you that we would be going into an ice age. Not next Friday, maybe, no. But in a couple thousand years, that's where we should be heading. So climate science deniers, those people will say, oh, but this is a natural cycle, and we're cooling, we should be heating up anyway, and that's actually wrong by people who studied this, by people who know this. So we actually should be getting cooling off. Instead, especially beginnings around here, where we start really going up, is at the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of burning of whale oil and of coal, to get energy, to get people, to get things done, initially innocently, and to make a buck, more or less innocently. And with that, humans climbed high, and they climbed quickly. And initially it was, if you were to look at a curve that was only over 100,000 years, a brief period of time, you would see that at about 1750, we start angling up like this, a little bit of a rise. And I should point out that scientists as far back as 150 years ago, people like John Tyndall, and people like Joseph Fourier, the famous mathematician, and then just after that, very good models were put out by Arrhenius, the person who described pH. He was was interested in things like acidification of the ocean and acidification of all kinds of things based upon CO2. So that was a sidelight for him. But scientists going back as far as 150 years have been talking about this. That's the point I want to make. So we see that there's a slight rise. If you saw a graph that was more spread out, a slight rise from 1750 to around 1880. 1880, it picks up a little more. Then after World War II, we got all kinds of new things, and people begin to consume more. And we start to build up the planet. We start to use a lot more fossil fuels. And at around 50, mid-50s, you see it starting to skyrocket. Now, you can't even, if we spread it out more, we begin to see that in the 70s, it's going crazy. And in the last 20 years, it's truly exponential. And if you've seen the movie An Inconvenient Truth, maybe you have, but Al Gore, in order to illustrate this, has to get up on he spreads it out. Then he gets up on this ladder and then keeps pointing and pointing and pointing to how high carbon dioxide goes. And eventually the ladder is mechanized and it has to keep going up and up. And it's a funny shtick. Unfortunately, it's a very tragic issue. And that is the issue of high CO2, which completely correlates. And it correlates well both experimentally, and it correlates in terms of measurements with the rise in temperature. We are now at above 400 parts per million. We have at times recently been as high as 407, but let's just say we're above 400. Human beings have never lived there. And we are going up faster than the paleoclimatologists say we've ever gone before, which doesn't give the flora and fauna enough time to evolve, does not give us enough time to adapt, and the Earth has never seen anything like it. So the next slide I'm going to show you has to do with the superimposable, as I said, because they are entirely related, cause and effect. And I will show you that slide, of temperature. Now this is the famous hockey stick curve that Michael Mann, among others, worked on. And it's looking only at 1,000 years. Not much, but times that we were around in the Earth. And the black line really represents temperature. And you see, once again, it's now spread out a little bit more, so you can see the Industrial Revolution coming up, and then you see that after 1950, bingo. The red are direct measurements. We've been able to directly measure temperatures on the surface of the Earth for about 180 years. The others are extrapolations that I said are very well scientifically documented, sometimes from tree rings, sometimes from ice cores, and sometimes, and you can extrapolate temperature as well as CO2 levels, and sometimes from actual coral. So these are the superimposable, these are the issues. CO2 is going up exponentially, and carbon dioxide is going up exponentially. And the largest source of global warming pollution is the burning of fossil fuels. I say that today in July of 2017. I think I got that right. But it may not remain that way, and that's a point I need to make. We don't know, because there are feedback loops and tipping points. One of the reasons I'm calling an emergency, and it's not just me. So let's talk about some of those potential tipping points. This slide, if it were working, would show you that a gentleman who's standing on the Siberian area that used to be covered with permafrost, which ain't so perma anymore, it's melted because of climate change, because of global warming. And you'd hear this kind of Rice Krispies stuff going on. And that Rice Krispies is basically carbon dioxide that is now being released. There might be some methane too when anaerobic bacteria work on the carbon dioxide from ancient plants and dead dinosaurs. When those things start to bubble up, you get very strange and unpredictable patterns. And it's very important for me to make the point that in the modeling that has been done by the most well-accepted modelers in the United Nations group, they don't know quite what to do with this permafrost issue. So when I talk about fossil fuels and the hockey stick and all that, we're mainly still, we think, only talking about fossil fuels. Pretty sure. But this is not factored in, this issue of the release of carbon dioxide from melting permafrost in Siberia, in Alaska, in the boreal regions. That's not factored in. And the release of carbon dioxide there is happening very quickly. The other tipping point, which is also generated by the fact we've heated up the Earth, is the fact that we've lost a lot of rainforests. And the rainforests, trees, and other vegetation are the lungs of the Earth. they inspire carbon dioxide, whereas we inspire oxygen, and they expire oxygen. And the more we lose of it, the more chance, the more CO2 is not put into a sink, is not brought down, is not sequestered. So we need more forests, but instead what is happening is more being burnt down, either for cash crops like cows or other crops that are not sequestering. This is happening in Indonesia, for example. It's happening in the southern cone of the Western Hemisphere to a dramatic degree. These are the lungs of the world. The other thing that happens is when you burn them down, you expose, remember that brown and how brown absorbs heat? You expose more brown and therefore absorb more heat, which makes global warming worse. At some point, when there's enough burning going on, these protective sources could actually become sources of carbon dioxide rather than sequester points for them. And that is a very dangerous situation indeed. Now, to show you the degree and the emergency situation we're in, this is not coincidence, this is not something that chance would predict, not 1 in a million, is that, I'm going to start that again. 16 out of the last 17 years have been record heat days, and the hottest ever measured was 2016. We're going to see what happens in 2017. There already have been records set in a couple of states, a handful of states, but we'll see. Even if it's the second hottest, that's still amazing and statistically incredible, but unfortunately true. When you have heat waves, you kill people. And this isn't something that will happen. This is something, and I can't say this strongly enough, that has been happening. It has happened over and over again. When the human being is exposed to temperatures that are too high, especially at humid temperatures, and that starts happening at about 100, I'm going to shift, usually I use Celsius because that's what climatologists talk in. Right now I'm going to shift to Fahrenheit. So 105 degrees Fahrenheit. At about that place, and it's especially if humidity is associated, you get increased rates of death from heat stroke. What is heat stroke? And other things. But heat stroke is basically a failure to thermoregulate, a failure of your own body to use sweating to cool yourself off by evaporation. Other things happen. If you have underlying medical issues of any type, if you have cardiac disease or are just older or are very young, like an infant, if you have pulmonary disease, if you have really a lot of even autoimmune diseases, the death rate goes up among such people. So when 105 degrees, and it happens fairly frequently, is very dangerous. In addition, the low level, they call them the short-lived climate pollutants, the low level close to the ground climate pollutants that kill people just basically by inhalation close to the ground, they get worse, they get more toxic the hotter the temperature is. So, before I go on to that, let me just mention another thing. And that is that the health effects of climate change, I said that they've been going on for quite a while, and I want to really drive that message home. In 2003, the media has not covered this very well, if at all. And I'm going to give some of the high-end estimates. There are some lower-end estimates too, but these are pretty well documented, and I think that the Lancet reported on it. 70,000 people in 2003 died one summer in Europe. They died from basically a heat wave. Well, maybe it was in some like little village somewhere and they didn't have air conditioners, and that's true in some places. But we're talking Europe, we're not talking, in Central Asia, we're really talking Europe. And some of those places didn't have the appropriate ways of dealing with the temperatures that occurred. In the city of Paris alone, 11,000 people died. Now I'm going to say something, and I'm going to say it very carefully, and I'm going to say it, I hope, with sensitivity. But I want us to remember back in December of 2015, thereabouts, when there was a terrorist attack on the city of Paris. And way more than 100 people died in nightclubs, and they were I think they were planning to attack other places, terrorists. And that was horrible. That was abominable. But it was something that happened, and it was something the world mourned. The world didn't really hear about the 11,000 people in 2003, so they couldn't be mourned. And let me also say this, that there are terrorists of many types. The fossil fuel industry has known more than 30 years. They have known way, way farther back than that what they were doing would be causing mass death. They knew it, but they wanted the profit. And we have now a lawsuit about ExxonMobil and they knew more than 30 years ago. So what I'm saying here is that killing people, even if you don't know who they'll be or when it'll happen, for greed, you're essentially a mass homicidal hitman. So I want to say that there are all kinds of terrorism. Now, returning to perhaps a less emotional subject, ocean heat content. That's very important, partly because it's killing off a lot of very important animals, plants, bases of the food chain, which we rely on. But it also supercharges, when you have a warmer ocean, it supercharges major weather events. So this one, if you can look and you can see that the Sunshine State is right there, you can probably guess that this is 2005, I believe, and it's Hurricane Katrina. And it's now ancient history, but yes, there was, would it have happened anyway? Probably. We cannot, in any given storm, say that it is caused by climate change. But we can definitely, in a situation like this, be sure that it made it worse. And it made it worse because ocean temperatures were higher at that time. When ocean temperatures are higher, and when sea level has risen, which it has, then you get these ocean-based storms being much worse. And here is some of especially in the poorer sections of New Orleans, in this case, what happened. There could have been better adaptation, pre-Katrina adaptation responses, but eventually these things are going to keep happening unless something is done. There won't be, for which adaptation, that is preventing, putting up flood walls, won't be enough. Another famous storm from 2012 was a perfect storm. And if you can use that word, it had everything going against it or for it, depending upon your frame of view. The sea temperature was 9 degrees higher, this is Fahrenheit, than it usually was. I believe it was in, it was in October, I do recall that, and a warmer time. Sometimes on the East Coast you get cold falls, but this was a warm one. And you'd had now a couple centuries of slow sea level rise, and kapow. This is the financial district of Manhattan. Well, it doesn't usually look like that. I have to say that I worked there for many years. The traffic's better, but it really, trust me, it doesn't usually look like that. The other thing that are happening with these ocean-based storms, and those are tornadoes and typhoons. I'm sorry, those are hurricanes and typhoons. And you can see that this is kind of a record, is that we had 3 Category 4 storms occurring at the same time in 2015. So they're getting more frequent, they're getting more strong, and storms that used to be, they call them 1,000-year storms. And what that technically means is that in any given year, there is 1 in 1,000 chance that they could happen. They're now happening at a rate of like you see a 1 in 1,000-year storm happening like every couple of years. And this is, you notice I'm staying close to home. I'm staying mostly in the United States because otherwise the slides would go on forever. And we are actually better prepared to deal with the problems than some of the other people in the rest of the world whom we should care about greatly. Their issues are often much greater, and they, over time, have contributed far less to the greenhouse effect. Now, the hydrologic cycle, another bit of review. Basically, we know that most water is from the ocean and it goes back there, but you have to think of the whole picture. So water gets evaporated when it's hot out, and more water gets evaporated when it's hot out. So you get more evaporation into the air. When there's more water in warm air, so the air is warm too now, well, right now, for instance, there's 4% more moisture in the air than there has been for many, many decades. And what happens with these kinds of situations, you get what are called atmospheric rivers. But even if you don't have a true atmospheric river, you get more precipitation. I want to talk just a little bit about atmospheric rivers because this year in California we had our share of them. Believe it or not, with all apologies to Jack Black, because that's all, they're called pineapple expresses. And for us in California, they come from the tropical, subtropical regions, some from Hawaii, hence the name. And they carry these rivers, literally rivers in the sky. And when they make landfall, they have these enormous effects of dropping, dropping enormous amounts of precipitation suddenly. And we have examples of that. So here in the Bay Area, we had like about 5 or 6 such episodes this winter and spring, and normally that does not happen. This is one that occurred over Montana. This isn't the Pineapple Express, but this is just an incredible downpour. And we see more and more of those as the air, the warm air, carries more moisture and drops it suddenly. Oh. Okay, now I want you to this is Oroville, and it wasn't that long ago. It was less than a year ago. There's a dam, and it's a dam that has been there for more than 40 years. I worked very close, actually, to this region, most of which ended up being on evacuation watch or was evacuated. So it's in California. Oroville, gold country. So what happened is it didn't break the dam, but they had to release water from it because it very nearly did. And that was from an extreme storm. And this is interesting. It happened, and you could say, well, hey, 1 in 1,000. Maybe if it were there another 4,000 years, it would happen 4 more times. But let's go on. This was a record, and the officials in Southern California told us that, I mean, this is LA. LA traffic's pretty bad, but got a little worse. This is actually was, by their meteorologic assessment, a record year for downpours and for flooding in Southern California. In Northern California, I have not been able to get that statistic. It certainly was among one of the heaviest precipitation years, but in Southern California, it definitely was. Now, let's do the other side of that coin, the hydrologic cycle. Because we continue to burn fossil fuels, 110 million tons every 24 hours, and who knows how much is coming from the permafrost, from below the permafrost. Because we continue to do that, we continue to heat up. And the same cycle, the same hydrologic cycle has another side to it. The water, the extra heat is also taking water out of the soil. So what is it causing? Of course, it's causing drought. This happens to be one of my few slides from out of the country, but you can go all around the world and find virtually the same picture. And this is Sao Paulo, Brazil. But this is the San Joaquin Valley, which received I believe in many portions more rain this year, and there may be some extra crops growing that weren't there before, but kind of no comment. That didn't use, well, no other comment. Hotter years typically have more fires, and just like CO2 levels are associated and map with the levels of surface heat, so does the temperature and fires. They map together, and so we have more fires. This is a picture, beautiful and horrible, from the Rim Fire, and that was in 2013. I remember looking out of a sixth floor hospital window in Merced, which has a good view of the kind of the entrance mountains into Yosemite. So the Rim Fire of Yosemite took out some of the most beautiful, more wildernessy parts of Yosemite, and that will be a long time in growing back. Now, obviously, unless this personage is a tourist, this isn't Yosemite. But this is a reminder that if you love more than trees, and you certainly love the firefighters, that it's happening around the world. And it isn't just happening to human beings. A lot of people feel like they might deserve it. I don't believe that at all. But there are things that can't evacuate, that live in those trees, are among them. What about them? Los Angeles was surrounded. The city itself was very hot, and people died because of it in last year, a little bit more than a year ago. But in surrounding areas around Los Angeles, California, there were tons of fires. So when you looked at the major part of Los Angeles, I mean, there is no Los Angeles. It's like this huge, I mean, where does it start and end? But you could see that was an example of my state burning down. Now, Phelan, California, once again, roughly a year ago. And this is, to me, an interesting, because where are we is that we're back at Oroville. Remember that dam that less than a year before had such a flood that it was nearly breached, that it nearly broke. Oroville is a city that has not burned down was built about 150 years ago. And it's a Victorian city. And now this is a slide from about 3-4 days ago. This is to illustrate a couple of things. First of all, 150 years, this didn't happen before. Circumstantial evidence, perhaps, but it's happening everywhere, so maybe not statistically. The other thing to keep in mind is that you can alternate flood with severe fire and severe drought. Ask the people of Texas. Ask people in many other states in the Southwest. Ask Californians. We can alternate drought, and we can alternate with flood. And the interesting thing about flooding is that you don't necessarily fill aquifers. It runs off very quickly and doesn't necessarily get into the ground. It also degrades the soil itself, so the greenery that grows back will not necessarily be the kind of greenery you want, and you lose your carbon sink. Furthermore, you end up with areas that are more prone to landslides after floods. So there are a lot of bad things, but the two can alternate. So a state, when we think of all that rain I just told you about that happened with Pineapple Expresses, that doesn't mean California's out of a drought. My suspicion is that we'll remain in a drought and have to figure out how to deal with it, because the conditions that are creating it have not been ameliorated. Okay, once again, this is about maybe a week ago max, and this is the San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara area. This is Butte County, which last year had the same problem. They're running out of trees, making it worse. And this is still going on as I speak today. We have again, we're getting toward Yosemite. This is Mariposa, and as you can see, it is on fire. It is on fire even now. Once again, a Victorian city. Now, this is just a summation of everything so far. So the red, appropriately, extreme temperatures, droughts, fires, floods, and mudslides. And you can see that from 1980 to 2016, they are truly stepping up rapidly, dramatically, perhaps exponentially. So we've discussed a lot about what we know. And now let's talk about tipping points. And the reason to consider climate change, climate disruption, something that should be thought about as an emergency, because there are tipping points that we really don't know, and to pretend that we do know about them, other than that they're happening and other that they're contributing to climate change, would be dishonest. So let's go into those. It would also be incomplete to not include those when we're talking about how quickly we have to move. So you've probably seen, maybe on the internet, these famous pictures of Siberia and other boreal regions where these huge kind of upward belchings of methane have occurred. And once again, loss of permafrost as the Earth warms. So it's not directly that the fossil fuels did it, but indirectly they did. So it is important, and I've said it before, but I'll say it again, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a United Nations organized group that has been methodically and in a very dedicated way and pretty, and you could argue in a way that has even been highly predictive of what is happening, that they have been reviewing this, modeling these things. We're on our 5th iteration. But even that panel, that esteemed panel, that honorable panel, does not quite know what to do with permafrost and have not really factored that into their equations. So you got stuff like this happening, lots of methane coming out. And let me let you know that methane is, in the short term, about 86 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So we've had all this trouble with carbon dioxide we've been talking about. Methane's 86 times more powerful over over a 20-year span. Now its life in the atmosphere is shorter than carbon dioxide. It only goes on for less than 100 years. But for that first 20, and boy, that's, in my opinion, the time that we have to really get this under control or to be safe. That we have to think about that 86 times more powerful. And these things are popping up, as Bill McKibben recently said, like Swiss cheese. Various kinds of holes are popping up in the boreal regions, in the very northernmost regions where there used to be permafrost that is not so perma anymore. This is something to be concerned about. We don't know how to model it in. So when predictions are made and when we're surprised when things go faster than predicted, it could be partly this. The other things that are not factored in to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, is what to do with albedo. They have worked a little bit on that, but not quite. So there are two things that happen when you lose glaciers. You lose albedo, you lose that ability to reflect sun-generated heat upward. You also, if it's land ice, like Greenland, you also cause sea level rise, and that's a big concern. James Hansen is focused on a lot of things. But he focuses and is an incredible expert on that issue of sea level rise, and it seems to be proceeding faster than predicted. Okay, the other thing that happens, well, speaking of sea level rise, let's talk about Miami. The Sunshine State. where you're not allowed to talk about climate change if you work for the government. But a normal day, so unfortunately this slide isn't working at this moment, but it will. A normal day of driving through Miami, going to shop at your local, big box store, people in bright sunlight are in waders, or as you can see from this photo and possibly this video, they're in cars that are getting their brakes splashed, and nobody says much because they're used to it, because it's been going on for years. It's called king tide, and it doesn't mean there's a storm. It's bright, it doesn't mean that there is a storm surge coming off the coast. No, it's just high tide because of sea level rise, which tends to affect the eastern United States more than the western, but don't count on it never coming here. So, and there's this very famous, you may have seen it on the internet, a picture of this poor octopus kind of like hanging out near a storm drain, looking like, what the hell did I get here? He just came up through the storm drain and he's quite confused. As Floridians are less, they're more used to it than that particular cephalopod, but this is not a normal occurrence, and this has not happened before in Florida until the last several years. Sea level rise. Other important things, national security. People care about that. And people care about refugees. And there are, many refugees that are fleeing bad situations. But as the Department of Defense, Pentagon, whatever you want to call them, they consider climate change a threat multiplier. And by that they mean the conditions set by climate change are far more likely to cause war, to worsen the conditions so that war is more likely, and other conflicts, including refugee crises. When you have food and water shortages, which are already occurring. If I haven't mentioned it already, I should say that roughly 30% of the world at times are facing water shortages, possibly more. So these things are happening now. And pandemic diseases. We could talk about Syria. We won't go into depth there, but keep in mind that they lost, in a drought beginning in roughly 2006, they lost 60% of their arable land and 80% of their livestock. So 1.5 million people start moving into cities like Damascus and other big cities without anything, making demands of a government that's already unstable. I'm not blaming the whole thing on climate change, but it played a big role. You don't light the Middle East up to 126 degrees Fahrenheit, which has happened recently, and expect it to be better. This is national security. This is your safety. The other thing, what about famine? We've now got famine going on simultaneously in 4 countries. Let me see if I can, so South Sudan, and there's political issues always in famine, but also there's just issues about how much you can grow. So South Sudan, Yemen, I believe Nigeria, and I feel a little bit like Rick Perry. I can't remember the 4th one. Oops. Anyway, so there are 4 major areas of famine that are going on right now. In addition, keep in mind that 800,000 people, 800 million people, nearly 1 billion people right now, are undernourished. And I'm not talking about the Western, the standard American diet of undernourished, where the food quality isn't as good, partly for lots of reasons. But we're talking about getting enough calories. So when we have 800 million people undernourished already, even a little change, and a population that's growing, even a little change in what's going on is terrible. So with every 1 degree Celsius, we'll go back to Celsius, there is a loss of 15% of the major grains that sustain the world. Rice, wheat, and some of the major staples. Now, 15%, it's between 10 and 17%, but that's a lot when you have what I already told you going on. It's a medical emergency, so I'm not the first one to say it, so I'm not the crazy doctor that you thought I was. Well, I am, but not for that reason. And Lancet, I believe it was June 22nd, 2015, their whole article was, their whole edition, they have a committee that works on climate change. And they made the declaration. And we won't go into all the reasons why they feel that climate change is a medical emergency. But one of the major ones that we can talk about very briefly is infectious disease. Things that used to be happy in hotter areas, the tropics and subtropics, are moving northward. They're moving pretty rapidly. And the other overlapping factor that exacerbates that is the fact that we travel. You know, somebody's going to have a wedding or bar mitzvah, and you're on the plane. You might go out of country, and there are Olympics could spread, and diseases, and that's one of the ways that diseases are spread. But the other very important way is that things are trekking upward as we get warmer. So possibly if you live in Minnesota, in the next 10 years, you're not going to get Zika. But we do know that, if you look at the map, you see cryptococcal fungus is, especially for immunosuppressed patients, a big problem. We do have dengue fever. I've seen cases of it myself. It's a very severe illness. And West Nile virus in the United States, and we're going to see more cases of that. So spreading around the world. And here's our, if you like insects, it's cute, but Aedes aegypti, the principal carrier of the Zika virus, it's not his fault or her fault. The other important issue is biologic diversity. We need that. The planet needs that in order for us to eat, in order for us to survive. We're all in this together. I like being in it together with that yellow, I guess you're a frog, not a toad. But we're losing 50% of land-based species during this century. And once again, here the timelines are vague, and I have to, keep reiterating that when this century, we don't know for sure. But we are losing them, and we're losing them rapidly. We are in the 6th extinction. Now that can be said. And so, what are all, this is a slide that you'll see in detail if you look at it and spend enough time looking at all the subheadings that are there. Just enormous number of things that are at risk. And it's, when there are that many things at risk, let's call it an emergency. Now, can we do anything about it? Hell yes. There's lots we can do. So sticking in California, let's use this as an example, but this person I'm going to talk about is not the only smart guy in the room. There are lots of people who are working and have worked very successfully at making the tools we need to combat climate change, to mitigate it, to making those things, those technologies kind of off the shelf, ready to go. As soon as we have the political will, it wouldn't take long. So I'm speaking now of Mark Z. Jacobson, professor of engineering at Stanford. I guess he couldn't get into Cal. I'm from Berkeley. So he and his team of engineers have long studied and modeled a plan that model that shows how one could get, within a matter of a few decades, to 100% renewables using only, he says wind, water, solar, because WWS, it has a better ring. But I would say wind, solar, water, because most of it will be wind and solar. Water would be less. Yes, there would be some issues in his model, not everybody's. There would be some hydroelectric use, but also tidal power. And tidal power is renewable. So what do we do? The path forward. It's easy. Very quickly, everything has to be powered with electricity. And that means transportation, and that means industry of all types, heating, cooling, and lighting. It means that we have to maximize energy efficiency. This is really important. And not only in homes and businesses, but let's take I don't have a slide for this, but this is that maximize energy efficiency also means let's cut back on needless expenses. There's a whole lot of stuff we do. We buy a lot of extra crap to comfort ourselves. And there has to be at some point a limit to consumption. And those, in my opinion, who say, well, we can have everything we want and have a GDP that grows at 20% per year, that's, in my opinion, although I'm not a psychiatrist, stark raving mad. That there will have to be some degree of checking our consumer addictions. And there will also have to be, whenever possible, sustainable behavior. Like if you can walk and it's a short enough distance for you, and if you can ride a bike if you're fit enough, and other things. So we're going to need to be more efficient. And I want to include personal efficiency and responsibility also. What's the good news? Why can this happen? Let's give some evidence. Without going into great detail, just like how many megawatts are becoming available, and between 1980 and 2016, it's soaring upward, the amount of global wind energy capacity. In addition, now, obviously, there's a little bit of hyperbole here. Globally, wind could supply electricity consumption for the world 40 times over. Now, that would probably be more than the amount of wind turbines we intend to put up. But you get the gist that, even, and Mark Jacobson and others have modeled that it wouldn't require a huge area, and a lot of it could be offshore. So there's a tremendous amount of power in what's natural in the wind. And solar photovoltaic installations are going up dramatically. The cost of the solar cells is dropping dramatically, so that is making it more possible. And then you have this effect called leapfrogging, and in a couple of sentences, what it means is that if you live in a place that doesn't have a big infrastructure, if you don't have AT&T or whatever utilities that have gotten quite powerful in this country or in many other developed countries, and you live in a place, let me give you an example that isn't climate change. Cell phones. So whenever it was, 1990, I don't know, whenever cell phones started becoming the thing, then it was before that, but anyway, roughly that time. Then they thought maybe that the first year they could sell like 900,000, and I think they did that in 3 weeks, something ridiculous like that. There are places in the world, and many of them, that don't have, because they're underdeveloped, which usually means overexploited, but don't get me started. They're underdeveloped areas in the world where they don't have to worry about Ma Bell, or it's an old term. They don't have to worry about the utilities. They can leapfrog over that and just go directly. So with cell phones, India, because it has been an overexploited nation, is a developing nation now. They had, if you've ever been to India a couple decades ago, phone stuff, getting a phone connection was a real dicey thing. Nowadays, I'm talking to people from friends in India, no problem. So the point I'm making is that you don't have to go, if you're not already dealing with corporate grids, it actually in some ways makes it easier for the developing countries to get there. This, I believe, is an example. I mean, you could argue that Chile is a more developed country, but it did a bit of leapfrogging. As you can see, that the solar voltaic market is really taking off, and so summing it up, it's grown dramatically in the last few years because the technology is cheap, because the technology is effective. So we're back to that other slide again that I probably belabored, but just to point out that every hour there's enough solar energy that reaches the planet to supply us all with energy for a full year. Now, it's not true that we'll suck up all of the sun's energy and the sun will die, as some of our current regime's spokespeople have said. They know better. But, and we don't have to, of course, get every bit of solar energy, but it's just, it shows you how much energy is there in natural places. And then when you talk about issues of intermittency, well, if you can store it, you're doing much better. And you can see that the amount of storage by megawatts is also going up dramatically, even in the United States, which there are utilities who really aren't that crazy about some of this stuff, and there are other interests who aren't crazy about this stuff. Talk about electric vehicles. Now, at the moment, some of them are inconvenient because they're either too expensive, or you might not have a place where you can charge it, or multiple reasons why you can't travel as far as you might want to travel. But more and more car companies are making them, and in the past you probably would have had to sell your home and possibly your firstborn to get a certain electric car. I won't mention names, Tesla, but other cars now, including those made domestically, are coming down in price. And that being the case, it's going to be a situation that if you can afford a new car, or even lease a car, that you'll be able to get either electric cars, or if you need to travel at times farther and you're not quite ready to rely on the charging stations, then you can get cars that have both hybrid and electric capacity. So when we get to that day that we're all electric and can be powered by clean green electric power, then then many people will be able to afford these cars. So can we change is the big question. And like I said, I would be doing something different than being here if I thought we couldn't. But it's going to take a lot. And yes, I guess I've answered that. And now I'm going to really wade into, well, that's the sin. I'm not going to wade into the sin, but I'm going to wade into an area of controversy. I'm going to possibly piss some people off. But hey, provocation, it can be a good thing. Because all of us would agree that 195, I think it ended up being 196 countries all told, coming together and saying, okay, this time we're serious. We want to do something about climate change. And it would have been a treaty proposal, a binding treaty proposal, if it wasn't for one country. Guess who? That they knew wouldn't ratify it. But they still, these countries were so committed and so, let me use the word, afraid, frightened, scared about what climate change could do, that they said, I don't care, we're going to do whatever we can. And they independently, they had these intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs, that they submitted to try to do whatever each country could do to bring down the amount of greenhouse gas levels. And by the way, during these, never mind, I can go off into tangents. You weren't allowed to use the word fossil fuels during these negotiations because the fossil fuel industry was funding part of the negotiation. It's a problem. Now, is it wonderful? That aspiration, yes. That humanity, yes. Seeing those people I mean, it was it was a tear-jerking moment when that treaty was posited. But as George Monbiot says, by comparison to what it could have been, it's a miracle. By comparison to what it should have been, it's a disaster. Why? First of all, in my opinion, it can be diversionary. I remember watching the Petroleum Broadcasting System, oh, sorry, PBS, I make that mistake. They have some Koch funding, by the way. Every day during the negotiations, it lasted a week, more than a week, I think, that they were covering it every day. But now, do they talk much about climate change? Would they invite a person who is talking about the rapidity, the abruptness of climate change to talk? You're not hearing that much. You didn't hear about the 70,000 who died in 2003, for instance, that I mentioned earlier on. So you can believe, okay, well, it was signed, and oh yeah, well, Trump is not doing it, but other countries are going to stick with it. So I guess something will happen good. And if you want to be in denial, you don't want to worry about this, and we don't, and I wish I were wrong, but climate change is a threat. You could turn off, and you could say, okay, diversion, it's done. I don't have to worry about it. Now, this slide is a little idiosyncratic in that it's taken from a particular person's analysis, but I want to talk with you about what it represents. So in the Paris agreements, they have agreed to stay below 2 degrees Celsius and to try to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which may or may not be possible. Let's say it is. And but they don't say by when, because the question isn't when, because they don't know. The question is just stay below. So you have to look at what's been happening, look at the exponentiality I've been showing you, and the statistical improbabilities I've been showing you, and come to the conclusion, if you want, that we are dealing with an emergency, and then decide, well, is 2100 really the year we're talking about? The Paris agreements do not give a year. But let's just follow this graph because it gives us a gist that business as usual will heat us further, will heat us 4 to 5 degrees Celsius above where we are. According to the most recent IPCC report. Now, actually, there are some scenarios that would place it higher. Now, this line coming down is just where this particular, this is 2030. That line coming down is just because that's a cross-section of where these particular analysts, these particular scientists were looking. They wanted to just see what would be happening at that particular time. But they know, there's no end point because it's not specified, right? It's just staying below 2 degrees. So we know that if we were to stop on a dime, like now, I don't know why it's quite at 2027 or something, but before 2030, in other words, if we would just to stop using fossil fuels, which, let's face it, is impossible. We can't. We would freeze and we would all, we just can't. But we have to do it very, very quickly. Then the chances of us staying with a safe climate below 2 degrees Celsius and possibly even below 1.5, arguably, is there. If we, at 2 degrees Celsius, then basically our chances of it would take longer, and this blue line is based on these scientists' analysis, and in order to get there by 2040, they said their basic contention is that the developed countries have to rapidly, the countries that can, that are the highest emitters, have to rapidly get off fossil fuels I think something like 40% by 2018. I may have the exact numbers wrong, and 90% by 2025, but really rapidly get off. So that would get us to a safe climate, and they're putting it at about 2040. And importantly, the Paris commitments put us at 3 degrees Celsius. And from what I've already told you, from what's happening now at 1.1 or 1.2, depending upon how you look at it, degrees Celsius is a disaster already, and we don't want it to be a worse disaster. It's not it's a disaster that I will not call unmitigated, because I think it's only partly unmitigated. I think we can mitigate it. But 3 degrees, there's some scientists who say, oh, we'll be okay, but not very many. So the next slide I'm going to pass by because it gets more into that paper and it's more complicated. All right. What would be, and now I'm stepping into ground that is also in some respects controversial, only because it's talking about things that a lot of people don't want to hear. And that's this. If we are in an emergency, shouldn't we respond as if we were? And a lot of people have said yes, and they said the answer, and this includes Bill McKibben, and remember, the 350 Bay Area was inspired by 350.org and works at times together with 350.org. Bill McKibben wrote last year an article about a World War II scale peaceful mobilization of all sectors of society in order to combat climate change. So it's war on behalf of peace. It's war on behalf of life. It's war on behalf of survival. And he's not the only one. It's been going on way before he's been talking about it. People there's a huge list of them. In fact, there's faces here. So Lester Brown, who's monitored what's been happening on this planet environmentally and otherwise for decades now. People like even Al Gore, although he's not like strutting that particular, he's not talking that talk anymore. We'll talk about why that may be true. Joseph Romm, a very fine scientist and writer. Naomi Klein has talked about a World War II scale mobilization. People like David Suzuki, Winona LaDuke. I could go on, but time doesn't permit me. And it was actually that kind of language was put into the Democratic National Platform in Orlando, Florida, but we didn't get the Democratic candidate. I'm not quite sure what we got, but that's how many people were actually beginning to, how this was resonating with people, that's what you do, you mobilize society. Now, okay, back. So the reason that it's been called a hidden consensus, and the reason it's been hidden is because people are afraid. I think the main reason is this: they don't think it'll sell, and we shouldn't base our truth-telling, in my opinion, morally, on what people want to hear. The truth is the truth, as Gandhi said, I think. And so people deserve the truth, and not to, because they're going to find it out anyway. So as this was beginning to, this clamor for a World War II scale peaceful mobilization against climate change on behalf of life was beginning to gain traction, then an orange cloud descended over Washington. And now, can we mobilize? Can we actually do that, given the fact that that orange cloud descended? And I'm going to say that there is a silver lining to that orange cloud, because he has been, for many of us, in the Sierra Club, in 350 Bay Area, and around the world, the recruiter in chief, bringing people out. Now, that's not him. But let me talk about what I have heard from very devoted, brilliant people, committed people, people who have worked morally all their lives on issues of environment, climate change, and justice. I've heard them say, you can't scare people into action. And my answer to that is, you want to bet? Let's give some examples. We've got to back up because this is the most dramatic. I'm sorry that it's based on war, but it is. And the United States in the 30s and 40s, they were not ready to go to war against fascism in states that were heavily armed, and we were in an isolationist mode and not really ready to do so. And yet, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, one of our territories was attacked, people, of course they were afraid. Were they scared? Yeah, people were scared. They might come in, you know, and kill us. I mean, there were like blackouts because they were worried that subs would see. I mean, there was real fear in this country, but people didn't go hiding in their closets. Women came out and worked as Rosie the Riveters, and men went to war. In this case, the jobs would be not those kinds of jobs necessarily at all. They would be jobs creating the armaments of peace, solar arrays, and wind turbines, and then maintaining those, so you get full employment too. So from fear, that was rapidly transformed into action. And it did so in a way that was unpredictably successful. And it's an example that happened so quickly. It happened in several years that we were able to come and to force a conclusion to defeat fascism, to that war. Whether you believe in war or not doesn't matter about this. It's the scale and it's the commitment I'm talking about. And so a country can do the right thing. Is our country at the moment inclined always to do the right thing? No. Let me give you some more examples of what you can do when that happens. But I do want to put the lie to that fear cannot be transformed into action. It can be. People were afraid of being lynched. They were afraid of not having their civil rights. And they were angry too. That's also a good one when it's peaceful. And when an important event is ready to happen, the people will be out there because we have the numbers. When my generation faced a vile war in Southeast Asia, the soldiers weren't vile, but the war was, do you think their families, the soldiers themselves, were not afraid of going overseas and killing or being killed? Of course they were afraid. But, well, some went to Canada, and some went to jail, and others did this. They took to the streets, and they said, we're going to stop it. And what is new about what's happening now under Trump is that we haven't seen for a long, long time is it was relentless, because I lived through this. And these types of demonstrations were going on constantly, especially in the bigger cities, but everywhere, because we knew we had to force the government to do the right thing. And so that's sort of my answer to, yes, you can scare people into action, and my answer to, what about the orange cloud? The answers are the same, is that with relentless public pressure, you can get your country to do the right thing. There are other examples. The AIDS epidemic. My medical career was born around the time that this epidemic started, and we had no cure. We had no way of putting the disease in a chronic remission, which is now fairly easy. And do you think people were not afraid of having a plague that was nearly 100% lethal? Of course they were. But what they ended up realizing when Ronald Reagan would not say the words HIV, would not say the word AIDS, is they said, we're going to have to tell the truth. We're going to have to, in many cases, say, I am in a high-risk group, and come out of the closet. And say, I am going to stand up, even if it means getting arrested, risking arrest, even if it means, if not getting arrested, getting in people's faces. So ACT UP was born, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And they actually shut down the stock exchange floor for a while, which I thought was a very cool thing. And they were relentless. And because of their work, the NIH, the federal government, began work that has now earned us, that has now won us the ability to effectively, to have effective treatments, highly effective treatments against HIV. But there was fear, once again, that turned into action. And here's another period of fear. This orange cloud descended over Washington. The very next day, now so the inauguration was supposed to be really bigly, but the next day was biglier. The next day, there were so many people in the streets, and not just in the streets of Washington, D.C., but all around the country. I happened to be in Sacramento, out of my usual stomping ground, and there were thousands of people there, many thousands. And so we're talking about, the streets being full of people who are afraid of the fact that we had basically elected somebody who, for all intents and purposes, seemed to be a fascist, and he's living up to that pretty well. But fear is keeping us active, and fear motivates us toward action. And then for people who think, well, but civil disobedience, and taking to the streets and telling your country, this is just something I came up with as a kid, and I like it, is that it's, I'm sure somebody else said it before me, but my country, right or wrong, no, dissent is as American as apple pie. So if we have to take it to the streets, if those are the kinds of things we have to do, even risk arrest or get arrested, for those who get arrested, for those who are possible, who are in good enough health, et cetera. These are things that should be encouraged. And that's one of the ways we overcome the orange cloud and the fact that it seems impossible. It isn't. Okay, and an example is actually Los Angeles, which is a big town, and it's actually beginning to mobilize. They want to get carbon neutrality by 2025. A lot of people think that's impossible. There's some organizations, including the climate mobilization, that, but others too, who feel that is necessary. Can we know exactly when the year is that we have to get to carbon neutrality to save civilization and the natural world? To be honest, we can't know for sure, but I hope that what I have presented before has shown you that we better get on it. So I applaud what LA is doing and stand in alliance with them. 350 Bay Area. So 350 Bay Area, to start with, if you want to start local. And at this point, most of the groups that and things that we need to do are on the local level, because there's so much that can be achieved on the local level. When you think of blockading, in This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein, she talks of a state of mind and a state of action called blockadia. If you have got coal shipments going through your town, if you have got bomb trains full of oil going through your town, you get in people's faces. You go to city councils and try to stop them. You write letters, you do whatever you can. And that would be called fossil fuel resistance. And as one of the campaigns of 350 Bay Area, as you might possibly guess, it's my favorite. But there's room, not everybody can do that. And everybody has their own talents. So 350 Bay Area can allow you to employ whatever talents you have and do what the famous writer and mythologist, I guess you'd have to call him, Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. The thing you like to do the most, even if it's not quite blissful, well, the thing you enjoy the most, go for that. Don't try to, if you really hate doing digital stuff, you don't go out and try to design a website. If you are terrified of public speaking, you're probably not listening to this. If you find legislation really intriguing, you might want to allow yourself there. You might want to write, so there are multiple campaigns, and with 350, you can leave today, you can tell you speakers who are speaking on behalf of 350, you can leave today and hand people a list of things they can go out and do, literally. And there are several campaigns. Once again, my digital skills have not provided me the most beautiful slide, and I'm going to very briefly, fossil fuel resistance is getting in their faces and stopping basically, if you're in a community where they're doing mining or extraction of fossil fuels, you block that in any way you can, whether it's at city council meetings or on the street or near the site of the mine or the drilling. You stop its refining, and that can happen a lot in the Bay Area where we're blanketed practically with refineries. You can stop fossil fuel shipments through Oakland, more on that later. If you really are interested in how laws are made or want to analyze, okay, what is this legislation really going to accomplish? And there's been some really excitement happening recent, some of it a little bit too exciting, but it is an exciting path to travel. And 350 Bay Area, in coalition, in most of these things, we are in coalition with other groups. 350 Bay Area has a tremendous legislative campaign that can find multiple ways. You don't always have to go to Sacramento and hang out there, believe me. BayCap is the Bay Area Climate Action Plan. Great with acronyms today. And they are basically targeting these very powerful entities, hope they stay powerful, and I believe they will, called the air districts. And you can become involved with this. It could be as simple as showing up to meetings which occur in San Francisco, or analyzing or doing analysis about clean air issues. Divestment is obvious. We want to get retirement funds. We want to get churches. We want to get synagogues and mosques and just every spiritual community. We want divestment from fossil fuels. And Speakers Bureau, I would call that the educational campaign. That's really important. You walk out into Berkeley, this is Berkeley, California, and you ask them, what does 350 parts per million mean? Even if you put in the parts per million, the majority of people have no idea. If you ask them to give a very brief, just encapsulate, a brief elevator talk about what causes climate change. This is Berkeley. Okay, so we need that. Transportation, we have a transportation engineer who heads up this, very important aspect, of course, related to climate change. Clean energy interfaith is obvious. Just some quick pictures to show you, perhaps. This is just an example of no coal in Oakland. There is an exhilaration, social exhilaration of being part of a movement. This is in front of the city council, which 2 days after this demonstration unanimously voted to stop coal shipments, which could be very dangerous. And this was an issue of environmental justice as well as simply blocking fossil fuels. That day was exhilarating, and the unanimous vote against the project was exhilarating. Now there's a lawsuit to try to turn it back. We'll fight that too. And we stopped the bomb trains, the oil trains going through Benicia, basically Valero. It was people power that did that. I wouldn't decorate. Our state house is beautiful, but I'm not sure I would decorate with that color of green for the rugs. But this is just to remind me what I've already told you, that the legislative group, the legislative campaign with 350 is extremely well led, extremely organized, has a lot of work for a lot of people to do. And so I highly recommend it to people who are interested in the legislative aspect, getting better laws passed. Divestment, we talked about that, it's obvious. The Bay Climate Action Plan is, as I said, working with air boards, to try to keep greenhouse gas levels, including at refineries, and we're, like I said, in Refinery City, and we've had some recent bad news, but we'll fix that. But trying to work with the air districts and trying to basically keep emissions down and keep it in a way that is environmentally just, keep down those levels, so that poorer communities, communities of color do not suffer, communities that have been exploited. Interfaith is obvious. If you ever see these people all together, please get their signatures and on a sign-up sheet for $3.50. And as I said, there is a social exhilaration. So on April 29th of this year, there was the People's Climate March, and it occurred all around the country. This is just our small version, which doesn't look that small, with hands around Lake Merritt. And this was it in Washington, D.C. So what we need is this kind of relentless push. And that is what we can get. We can get a grassroots support from all over the country, all over, indeed, the world. Because this is, as I said earlier, the most important struggle, the most important moral action that any of us can ever do. Like these people focused on maintaining the life of one human, we can maintain the life, the livability of a planet that is graced with life. Yes, we've had some dark clouds, some orange clouds, but there's light breaking through. And the beauty of our area, of a planet that is graced not just as a beautiful blue marble, but graced by life, we can maintain that because we must. It's way too late for pessimism. So I thank you for your time.